So the first thing you want to think about when exposing for whatever light you have available to you. This episode is going to be more about natural light, so we're only going to be using the sunlight. Exposing for light, essentially what photography is all about. So let's not lose sight of how incredible that is and how far photography has come 100 some odd years ago. Let's talk about the 3 different settings that we can shift and change to get an exposure. These 3 settings are your aperture, shutter speed, and your ISO. So let's start with aperture. What is your aperture? Your aperture is a circular iris inside of the lens itself. So it's actually not a part of the camera, it's going to be in the lens. Like your eyes, when it's dark, your pupils will expand and it will let in more light. And when it's super bright out, like it is today, your pupils will contract and let in less light. The same goes for the camera. The wider your aperture, the more shallow the depth of field will be. And the more contracted the aperture, the more depth of field you'll have. So let me show you what a wide open aperture looks like when looking through a lens that can shoot wide open. Alright, so as you can see, pretty much everything is out of focus except for where the focus lands. And that is pretty tight. It's great at isolating a subject so that you can really focus in on it. So it takes away everything else in the background. Let me show you what this looks like at its highest aperture. Alright, so this is at f16, and you can see the difference between what the 1.4 offers and what the higher aperture offers. Most everything is pretty in focus and it gives a certain effect. So it's something to think about when capturing your subject, is how wide or how closed down do I want my aperture to be. So let's talk about shutter speed. Okay, shutter speed is really interesting because it has to do with whether an object is going to be frozen in time, or is it going to move through the frame and leave some sort of itself behind. So, shutter speed, what is it and how can I use it? Shutter speed is how fast your shutter curtain closes down and how much light then is allowed in for X amount of time. So let me show you some examples of a slow shutter speed and a high shutter speed. So I'm going to use these leaves as an example. I'm going to start off with a high shutter speed. I'm going to move the leaves and you'll see how they will look as though they're not moving at all. So this shot was taken at 1/25,000th of a second. So as the leaf moved through the frame, and the curtain was only open for a fraction of a second. And so because of that, the plant hasn't had time to move fast enough to show any kind of movement in the frame. So let me show you what it would look like with a slower shutter speed. As you can see in this image, even though I moved the plant just as much as I did with the other one, the shutter has been open for 1/60th of a second, which allows for more movement of the plant to move through the frame as the shutter opens, thus giving you movement in the frame. One of the most difficult things to do is sometimes getting a high enough shutter speed so that you can have a still image. And that's where ISO comes in. So what is ISO? Basically, what ISO allows you to do is increase your sensor sensitivity to light so that you can still get a proper exposure even in pretty low light conditions. The drawback to increasing your ISO is the higher your ISO, the more grain is introduced into the image. And it really depends on what you're going for. And so there isn't a perfect setting for whatever situation you're in. If you would like to have a little more creative control with your images, being able to understand how your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO all interact with each other and how they change the image can be really beneficial and can kind of unleash your creative potential by pushing these settings to their extremes. So when you think about your style of photography, it's not about doing it right, getting it perfect. Am I a good photographer? Those are questions for professionals who are working for a paycheck. What's your vision? What are the things that you've experienced that bring a unique take into your own perspectives? Because cameras give us an inside look into the photographer. And don't forget to put the camera down sometimes and just enjoy what's around. What we went over today was exposure. We talked about aperture, shutter speed, and then ISO. Once you begin mastering these tools, your creative potential increases. I hope you all enjoyed this video. I know I learned something, and I hope you learned something as well. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video, guys.